By the fall of 1918, German troop strength was declining to a critical level. In 6 months, the strength of the Kaiser's army had fallen from 5.1 million to 4.2 million. The army's discontent with its leadership was beginning to find a voice.
I went through the streets of Frankfurt and was not saluted. I was a commissioned officer, and in the German army the order was we had to be saluted. It was not the only soldier I met who didn't salute, but there were quite a number who refused to salute. I realized that the discipline and the mood of the people was really bad. We hadn't realized it at the front, how bad it was at home. People were fed up with war. They wanted the war to be ended as soon as possible, victory or no victory.
Staff officers began circulating a paper calling for negotiations with the Allies to be initiated at once. On August 30th, General John Pershing achieved his purpose of bringing the American First Army into being. It was immediately deployed south of Verdun, opposite the tangled and waterlogged ground of the St-Mihiel salient, which had been in German hands since 1914. On September 12th, Pershing launched the first all-American offensive of the war. In a single day, the American 1st and 4th Corps drove the Germans from their positions, capturing 466 guns and taking 13,251 prisoners. After 4 years of a war in which they had destroyed the Tsar's army, trounced the Italians and Romanians, demoralized the French, and, at the very least, denied the British a clear-cut victory, the Germans were now confronted by an army whose soldiers sprang in uncountable numbers, as if from soil sown with dragon's teeth. A sense of the pointlessness of further effort rotted the resolution of the ordinary German soldier. Reports began coming into Ludendorff's headquarters of German troops surrendering to a single soldier or isolated squadron. Suddenly, he saw the war as hopeless. In the presence of King Wilhelm, he blamed the defeat on lack of discipline. Wilhelm countered Ludendorff's comment, complaining that too much had been asked of the troops. A telegram from Emperor Karl of Austria was handed to Wilhelm. The Austrian emperor informed his ally that the war must be ended in 1918. Otherwise, he, Karl, would conclude a separate peace. Wilhelm, shaken with head bowed, informed Hindenburg and Ludendorff that the war must be ended. Foreign Minister Hintze stated that he wished for a peace based on President Wilson's 14 points, hoping this would prevent revolution in Germany. He suggested the creation of a new parliamentary government and making Wilhelm a constitutional monarch. Wilhelm reluctantly accepted, believing this might help save his throne, and he signed a decree granting new powers to Germany's parliament. On October 3rd, Prince Max of Baden, Wilhelm's cousin, was sworn in as the chancellor of a new parliamentary government. The chancellor was now responsible to Parliament rather than to Wilhelm. The question of war and peace would now be the responsibility of Parliament, representatives of the German people. On October 4th, the new government sent its request for an armistice to the Allies.
To avoid further bloodshed, the German government requests the President to arrange the immediate conclusion of an armistice on land, by sea, and in the air.
Wilson's reply to the German request for an armistice arrived in Berlin on October 9th. Wilson asked whether the new government spoke for the German Empire, and if so, whether it was prepared to accept his 14 points unconditionally. By now, Ludendorff and Hindenburg had stopped supporting a negotiated settlement and were distancing themselves from any compromise settlement or surrender to Allied demands. Rather than seeing the war as lost, Ludendorff was now for fighting on the defensive through 1919. He and the German Admiralty insisted that submarine warfare continue. On October 20th, Hindenburg told Prince Max that his government should keep Germany fighting for our honor to the very last man. And if this resulted in Germany breaking off negotiations with Wilson, said Hindenburg, so be it. A third note arrived in Germany from Wilson on October 23rd, with Wilson demanding that if Germany's military masters, including Wilhelm, were still in power, they had to step aside. that the United States would negotiate only with representatives of the German people. On October 26th, during a shouting match between Wilhelm and Ludendorff, Ludendorff resigned, complaining later that Hindenburg, who was present, had made no attempt to defend him and was therefore guilty of treachery. In Berlin, the Chancellor, Prince Max, saw the writing on the wall and acted on his own by announcing the abdication of Wilhelm and his sons. Then Max resigned as Chancellor, handing the government to the leader of the Social Democrats, Friedrich Ebert. Wilhelm refused to accept what he called a coup d'etat, but his refusal was without effect. On November 10th, the House of Hohenzollern fell, rejecting suggestions that he should seek death in the trenches as incompatible with his position as head of the German Lutheran Church. Wilhelm II departed by train to exile in Holland, never to forgive Hindenburg for what he called his disloyalty. At 5 a.m. on Monday morning, November 11, 1918, 9 grim men agreed to sign the papers laid out on a table in a railroad carriage parked in a forest 37 miles north of Paris. At 5:12, 2 French generals, 3 British naval officers, 2 German politicians, a German general, and a German naval officer started signing the armistice, which would end the World War that had raged for more than 4 years. The last signature was in place by 5:20, making it official. At 11 o'clock, all fighting would cease. By 5:40 a.m., the news of the signing had reached the capital cities, where impromptu celebrations broke out. Big Ben rang out in London for the first time since 1914.
We had had so many years of suffering. 4 years of dull suffering, acute suffering, pain everywhere. It was dreadful. Every day we heard about somebody we loved being killed, being wounded. There was no relief anywhere, and we thought it would go on and on and on forever. But it didn't, because armistice came.
And we carried on into Mons and got to the main street, which was filled with the inhabitants, screaming their heads off and shouting. I didn't seem to know what had happened to them. And as I got to the town hall in the main street of Mons, the church clocks chimed. It was 11 o'clock.
Slowly, the news came in officially that an armistice had been signed. But there was no show of emotion. No one went berserk or anything like that. We were too far gone. I mean, say, the perceptions, our emotions were all killed long ago.
Although it took longer for the soldiers in the trenches to get the news, the generals along the Western Front knew the armistice would be signed at 5 a.m. and that fighting would stop 6 hours later. Until then, they were determined to gain favorable positions should the ceasefire fail, and, not incidentally, to continue to punish the Germans up until the very last minute. Generals under American General Pershing launched attacks as late as 10:30 a.m. Some French units were ordered to attack at 9 a.m. and cease at 11. The British attacked, relishing the idea of recapturing Mons, Belgium, on the last day of the war. Mons was the site of their first battle and first defeat in August 1914. Artillery batteries fired salvo after salvo into the German lines, simply to avoid having to haul the unused shells away. On that morning of November 11th, while the world started to celebrate and word continued to filter down to the troops that the fighting would cease at 11, there were almost 11,000 casualties, including nearly 2,700 killed. British Empire losses that morning were around 2,400. 40-year-old Private George Edwin Ellison was the last British soldier to die at 9:30 as he scouted the outskirts of Mons, the same place where the first British soldier had died. George was one of the few old soldiers who had been shipped across the Channel in 1914 and had fought at Mons in September of that year. Against all odds, he had survived over 4 years in the trenches to be killed 90 minutes before the end of the fighting. The last Canadian to die was 25-year-old Private George Lawrence Price. He was shot by a sniper at 10:58. American losses that morning were estimated as high as 3,500. Some of Pershing's generals saw a last chance at glory, and believing the armistice was letting the Germans off the hook, Pershing did nothing to dissuade them. U.S. Marines suffered more than 1,100 casualties trying to cross the River Meuse. Had they been allowed to wait until 11 o'clock, they could have safely crossed the river with no casualties. Henry Gunther of Baltimore, Maryland, was the last American and the last Allied soldier to be killed. He and others advanced through the fog toward 2 German machine guns. The Germans fired a burst over their heads, and the Americans dropped to the ground. The Germans, knowing that it was almost 11 o'clock, assumed that would be the end of it. But Gunther got back up and started running at them. The Germans shouted and waved at him to stop, but when he didn't, they fired a burst of 5 shots. One of them struck Gunther in the left temple, killing him instantly. It was 10:59, 60 seconds before the end of the war. German losses that morning were about 4,100, as many of them were retreating and therefore more exposed. Surviving German records are not clear about the last German killed in the war, but the last German and last soldier killed may have been a Lieutenant Thomas. After 11 o'clock, he approached some American soldiers to let them know that since the war was over, he and his men were vacating a house and it would be available. Unfortunately, no one had informed the Americans of the armistice, and they shot him. In a war of unprecedented carnage and destruction, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were ordered out of the relative safety of their squalid trenches to walk unprotected across open land toward enemy machine guns, it may seem that the morning of the last day was just more of the same. It is only when taken out of the context of that war and compared to another even larger war that its true horror emerges. For on that morning, with only a few hours to endure, when all the generals had to do was nothing, more men were killed, wounded, or missing than both sides suffered on D-Day in June 1944 during the Normandy invasion.
There'd been one German machine gun unit giving our troops a lot of trouble, and they kept on firing until practically 11 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, the officer stepped out of their position, stood up, lifted his helmet and bowed to the British troops, fell all his men in the open in front and marched them off.
As the guns fell silent, the slaughter came to an end in no man's land.
No flash of howitzers on the horizon, no downward droning of the shells, no machine guns, no patrols going out, just nothing. Silence.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war, it's a lovely war. Oh, to be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings a breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home for the right turn, how will we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, what will be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Come for us, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.